So let's begin. As you know, the title of today's webinar is Avoiding the Plateau. So developing an effective approach to teaching C1 and higher level students. So I'd like to start today's webinar with a quote. So, is to learn twice. So can you complete this quote? Maybe you can write the answer in the chat box. Okay, a few different answers. Practice, yeah. Review, okay. Yeah, I've seen a lot of the correct answer. Teach, yes. So to teach is to learn twice. So of course, this is true of all teaching. However, I think it's particularly true of teaching English to higher level students, especially if English isn't our first language. Okay? The challenge of having to teach English to higher level students really inspires us to get to know the language ourselves inside out, okay, to really deepen our own understanding of it. So we know there are many challenging aspects to teaching higher level students, but there are also some very kind of rewarding elements to it. Okay, for example, well, with higher level students, of course, there is the potential to have more in-depth and detailed discussions on a wider variety of topics. This is, of course, because of the more developed vocabulary of our students. So it's through these discussions that often new language will emerge very kind of organically. Remember, we know that students can learn from each other as well as us. So another enjoyable and rewarding aspect is the fact that by this level, students are usually able to produce very kind of interesting and more engaging written texts, which are often genuinely kind of interesting to read. And finally, with our higher level students, there is a much greater potential to use more complex and immersive activities, some of which we'll be looking at later today, but particularly in my next 2 webinars in this series. So, when I refer to higher level students, I mean kind of students who are C1 and almost C1. Okay. The question is, what exactly constitutes a C1 level student? Where do we draw the line between B2 and C1? Well, if we look here, we have a can-do descriptor from the Central European Framework of Reference. So this one refers to reading. So do we think this refers to B2 or C1? So you can let me know in the chat box, do we think this refers to B2 or C1? Okay. Yes, I'm seeing lots of correct answers there. Yeah, so this actually refers to B2, okay? If we look at the can-do descriptor for C1, we can see that higher level students, so students who are C1, should be able to understand a wide range of demanding and longer texts, and also recognize implicit meaning in texts. So by implicit meaning, I mean the meaning which is inferred or suggested. Okay? This is the ability to read between the lines and see what the writer is really saying. So now we have another can-do descriptor, this time for speaking. Again, do we think this is for B2 or C1? What do you think? Okay, good. Thank you, Olga and Anastasia. So again, lots of correct answers. Yes. So this is for C1. So we know that by the time students reach B2, they should be able to make points, quite smoothly without any major problems. However, by the time our students are C1, they should be able to speak fluently about a range of topics and also using many different registers, for different effect. And finally, we have one here, another can-do descriptor, this time about writing. So again, do we think this is referring to B2 or C1? What do you think? Okay, so you're all saying, a lot of you are saying C1. Are you correct? This actually refers to B2. Yeah, I see some of you. Yep. Katerina, yes. I see some of you with the correct answer. So it is for B2. If we look at the can-do descriptor for C1, we can see that by this level, students should be able to produce clear, well-structured, detailed texts. Okay? The emphasis is more on students having a better command of the structural elements of writing. Okay, so for example, the kind of cohesive devices. Students should be able to use different registers and different structural elements depending on the genre and the audience of their text. So of course, there are many similarities between the two levels, but there are some key areas which really set them apart. So in later webinars in this series, we'll be looking at how we can really develop our students' abilities in these areas. So, as I mentioned earlier, there are many challenges which are inherent in teaching higher level students. If we want to develop an effective approach to teaching these students, we need to try and understand the roots of these challenges. Okay, so firstly, here we have the developmental curve of a typical language learner. Okay, so we all know that once students grasp the basics of the language, they are able to progress relatively quickly. Okay, they can learn whole grammatical rules and large amounts of vocabulary in a relatively short amount of time. However, when students reach kind of higher levels, this kind of development slows and becomes less obvious. Instead of learning whole rules, they are often learning exceptions to rules they learned in the past. And a lot of time is spent simply reinforcing what they already know. Some students may also feel that they have hit a plateau with their development. So this is a point at which students stop progressing. So have we experienced this with any of our students? So have any of your students feel that they have hit a plateau with their development? Yes. So I'm sure a lot of you have experienced this. And how do your students feel? How do your students really feel when they reach this point? What do we think? So how do they feel when they stop, making progress? Yeah, they can definitely become frustrated, bored. Yeah, exactly. They can become very demotivated. If we want to maintain our students' motivation for learning English, we need to develop an approach which helps our students to avoid hitting this plateau. Okay. In the next part of this webinar, we'll be looking at how exactly we can do that. Okay. Of course, students of any level can hit this plateau, but it is particularly kind of common with higher level students. So another challenge we need to deal with is students overestimating their own language ability. So it's quite common for some students at this kind of level to get quite cocky about their level of language, okay? To be slightly overconfident. Maybe they think they can speak fluently without making any errors, or they already know everything. So have any of you got any students like this in your class at the moment? Or have you had students like this in the past maybe? Yeah, so Christina, yeah, I can see. Yeah, so I'm sure everyone has got a few students like this. I mean, to put it politely, yeah, they're a challenge, shall we say, to teach. Yeah, so it's not always easy. Of course, we want all our students to be confident users of the language. However, when the students get overconfident or kind of really cocky, this can have a negative impact on their motivation and also have a negative impact on the dynamic in the classroom, as some of these students feel that they are above kind of participating in activities, okay? So it can make things a bit awkward in the classroom sometimes. So this false belief that they already know everything, okay, is often based on the fact that they don't fully appreciate the complexity of the language they're learning, okay? Or they might not be aware of the gap which still exists between their current use of the language and a more native-like use of the language. Of course, it's our responsibility to kind of bring them down to earth a bit, to give them a reality check, yeah, to kind of help the dynamic, keep a kind of nice, healthy dynamic in the classroom. So another challenge we need to deal with is fossilized errors, okay? So we know that fossilization is the process of a mistake. When students make a mistake repeatedly, so much so that it kind of becomes a habit, which consequently is very difficult to correct. So I can think of an example maybe with one of my students. So when I was teaching in Budapest in Hungary, I used to have an advanced level student, and every time we would have a discussion, he would always say, "I think yes," instead of "I think so." Okay, and he would do this every time. Okay, and I think simply this was because he had been learning English for years and none of his previous teachers had corrected him. Okay, so can you give me any examples of fossilized errors that your students make? I can tell you another one. This was a problem with, again, Hungarian students learning English, that they would always confuse he and she. Even advanced level students, This was simply because in Hungarian, they only had one word for the third person pronoun, so they would confuse this. Yeah, so using double negatives, that's a good example. Yeah, even some English people do this. So I don't know nothing. Yeah, so you will hear some native speakers say that as well. Okay, yeah, Hala, maybe explain me instead of explain to me, explain something to me. Get this and these, possibly, yeah. Yeah, so lots of good examples there. So we know, okay, this is particularly a problem for higher level learners because by this late stage in their development, many of the errors have become completely fossilized. So it's very difficult for them to notice that they're making them. Okay. Of course, it feels very difficult to correct these errors, but it's not impossible. And as we will see later, particularly in the next webinar, that's next week, okay, there are ways that we can do that. Okay, there are activities we can use to help our students with these fossilized errors. So another challenge, of course, in our classroom, higher level classroom, there is often a knowledge and skills imbalance. So some students are very, very strong in some areas and still surprisingly weak in others. Some students might have a fantastic grammatical knowledge. They might be like a walking reference book, but they might not be able to write a well-structured essay, or they might not be able to speak fluently in a way which really shows off their fantastic kind of vocabulary. So we know that it is our responsibility to find these areas where our students are weaker and to address the imbalance. So we already know that through formative assessment in the form of tests and homework and also informal observations in the classroom, we can find out which areas our students need to develop. However, another important tool that we can use to do that is needs analysis questionnaires and informal discussions with our students. So these are a very effective way of finding out what our students perceive to be their main kind of weaknesses. So do any of you use these do any of you use needs analysis questionnaires with your students at the moment? You can let me know in the chat box. Yeah, so I can see. So discussions, yeah. Sometimes discussions, yeah, it's more appropriate. You might not have time, for example, to give the students a questionnaire and get them to fill it out. Discussion, yeah, you can kind of react to the answers they're giving as well. Get more information from them. Of course, if we do use questionnaires, it's important to remember that we don't need to write our own from scratch. Okay, there are many templates on the internet which we can just adapt to make them appropriate for our own course. Okay, and I know that many of you are restricted in terms of changes you can make to your course content. Okay, maybe you have a very strict kind of syllabus that you need to stick to. Well, if we are able to identify common weaknesses in a class through a discussion, a needs analysis discussion, we don't need to make big changes to the course content. Okay, all we need to do is maybe just increase the focus on these skills in particular lessons, okay? Or just increase the amount of homework that we are giving our students to improve these particular skills or areas of knowledge. Okay? By using needs analysis questionnaires and discussions with our students, we are kind of giving the students the feeling that they have some control over the future content of the course, which I always find has a really kind of motivating effect on them. So now we've looked at some of the challenges involved in teaching higher level students. Now, how can we develop an approach to help our students avoid this plateau we talked about, so we can really maintain their motivation? Okay, well, one way that we can maintain our students' motivation, as we already know, is to make sure that they are adequately challenged in lessons. Yeah, we know that if we start teaching the students something which is too easy for them, then they immediately switch off. So what we need to be doing is really challenging each student at their own individual learning edge. So learning edge, this is the limits of our students' kind of knowledge or skills at the moment. So we need to try and push our students to this point, and then get them to take one more step, to really push them past this current point, so they are then developing. So I know maybe that sounds easy in theory, but in practice, it might not be the case. So how can we do it? Well, it's not just a case of giving our students more kind of complex tasks. Obviously that helps, but it's not just a case of that. We also need to be more demanding regarding the quality of answers and responses that we expect from our higher level students. Okay? One simple tweak to our teaching technique can be to avoid rubber stamping. So what is rubber stamping? Well, rubber stamping, this is when a student gives us a correct answer and we immediately say good or correct. So we immediately confirm that their answer was correct, and we maybe move on to the next question. So I'll admit, so when I was a kind of new teacher, almost 10 years ago, I used to do this a lot. So I used to think that if I could get through lots of questions in one class, then it was a successful class. But now I know that's not true. Okay? So why is this a problem? Why is rubber stamping, such an issue? Well, if we immediately confirm that a student's answer is correct, then we shut down the potential for any further discussion with other students about what other answers might be correct and why. So we're really missing an opportunity for more kind of cross-class kind of interaction and communication with our students. Even more importantly, with higher level students, is we miss the opportunity to get our students to upgrade and improve the answer that they've given. Instead of immediately confirming that a student's answer was correct, we should be encouraging them to kind of improve an aspect of the answer they've given if there is scope to do so. So if it's possible for them to do so. So to help our students, we can, ask them a question maybe to highlight what aspect of their answer they can improve. So, like if our student gives us an answer with a very average level of vocabulary, we could say to them, yeah, okay, good, but can you think of a more precise word than interesting? Or can you think of a more precise word than angry? Okay, so getting our students to kind of really use this fantastic vocabulary that they have. If we are looking at some functional language with our students, maybe having a discussion or something, they give us a correct answer, but we want to improve it. We could say, which words could you have stressed there to really emphasize what you're saying? Or if we're looking at a text and the student gives us a correct answer, but it's not very insightful, we can say, okay, but is there a different inferred meaning in the text there? So we're just kind of encouraging our students to kind of read between the lines and to kind of push them to the limit of their current abilities. So again, of course, we should still confirm that our students have given a correct answer. We should still praise them, but we should be looking for these opportunities to really push our students to this learning edge and get them to take just one more step. We can get them to take this step a few times in one lesson, and they're really developing and they're avoiding this plateau. So how else can we increase the challenge? Well, of course, by incorporating a wider range of authentic materials into our classes. So including podcasts or videos or even webinars. Yeah. We'll be looking at how we can do this a bit later. So what about those cocky, overconfident students? How do we deal with them? Well, sometimes we need to be cruel to be kind. Okay? So we need to give them a bit of a reality check. So we need to kind of be sensitive but direct with the feedback we're giving them. Okay? We want to show that we appreciate that they have reached this level with learning their language, learning English. Okay, it's fantastic. But we need to highlight that there is still a gap between their current level, their current use of the language, and a more native-like use of it. Okay, or we need to highlight that there are still gaps in their use of the language. Maybe they still haven't really mastered the use of kind of idiomatic language. So how can we do that? So how can we really highlight the gap, get the students to notice this gap? One activity I like to use is an advanced Dictagloss. So how many of you have used a Dictagloss before? So how many of you have used a Dictagloss before? Okay. Good. So yeah, so I see some of you have. Some of you haven't yet, not very often. Okay. So it might be new to some of you. So what we'll do is we'll look at the procedure for a Dictagloss. Okay. So Dictagloss, as some of you know, this is a dictation activity. Okay, so basically we start by finding or producing a short text, which we then dictate to our students. Okay? So our students listen and take notes. Okay? So I tell the students before I start that later in the class, they will need to reconstruct the text that I'm reading. They will need to rewrite it. I also tell them, especially when I do it with my students, I say, don't try and write down everything I say. Okay, you won't be able to. Just focus on the key words, the key information. Then we put the students into pairs or to small groups, and they pool their knowledge. So they use all their notes, and then one person in the group has to rewrite the text so it is as close to the original as possible. So we call this, a reconstruction activity. Then we give the students the original text that you dictated to compare with their text. So by comparing their reconstruction with the original, this really highlights any gaps in the student's knowledge, really highlights any mistakes that they have made. Okay, it shows to these kind of overconfident, cocky students that maybe their use of the language isn't as good, isn't as perfect as they thought. Okay. Once the students notice that they have these gaps in their knowledge, it means that the inputs, we can then give them kind of remedial inputs. Okay. And because the students know they need it, it is more likely to become intake. So they're more likely to actually remember it and learn from it. So, as I said, you can actually use this with any level from kind of intermediate upwards, but to make it more challenging for advanced level students, I'll often include kind of bits of idiomatic language, or maybe include exceptions to grammatical rules, that I want to introduce in that lesson. Okay. Also, I'll read it at a speed and in a way so it includes elements of connected speech. So maybe assimilation, when the words blend together, or elision, so when we're missing out certain sounds. Okay, just to make it more challenging for them. So another way that we can, bring them down to earth is giving praise a bit more sparingly. So with higher level students, we should only really be praising like truly special moments, when they are showing really advanced level skills. For example, if they are able to speak for an extended period without making any mistakes, or if they are able to, for example, use some idiomatic language very accurately, then we should be praising the students. Okay. So by praising the students a bit more sparingly, okay, the praise takes on more value to the students, which means when we do give it, it is much more kind of motivating for them. So now moving on, as I mentioned earlier, we know that when students reach C1, okay, or higher levels, the progress that they're making, progress can be a lot slower and a lot more laborious. Okay, if our students want to avoid hitting this plateau, they need to do a lot more work kind of independently outside of class. Okay, that's why a very important aspect of teaching higher level students is fostering learner autonomy. So by learner autonomy, I mean the ability of students to work more independently to continue to develop their knowledge and skills outside of class. Okay. As I mentioned earlier, some students are very strong in some areas and very weak in others. If we can equip our students with the skills they need to work independently, or if we can encourage them to work more independently, then they can then focus more on these areas which they really need to develop. So one area which many higher level students still have problems with is writing. Okay, so this is often an area which can be a bit neglected. So one way that we can develop our students' writing skills and also encourage them to work more independently is through the use of portfolios. So this is basically an organized collection of our students' kind of written work over a course. So how many of you require your students to keep portfolios at the moment? So how many of you require your students? Okay, so from time to time. Yeah, good. So I can see this is a popular kind of requirement with your classes. Yeah. So by portfolio, I don't mean just, one folder where the students just throw all their work after they finished it. This should be, a well-organized, systematic collection of the work. When I do it with my, for example, exam preparation classes, I always ask the students to organize their folder according to text type. So if they are having to produce different types of texts, I'll get them to organize it that way. Of course, we know that whenever our students produce a text, we should always be encouraging them to redraft some of it, okay? Redraft all of it if they have time, or just one or two kind of key paragraphs. If our students are keeping these drafts and the feedback that we're giving them in these portfolios, it becomes a very useful, personalized resource for the students, okay? It can show them which areas of their writing have improved and which, still need more work. If the students keep, the drafts together, then with our feedback, it's easier for them to see that they are making kind of progress. It highlights to our students that they haven't hit a plateau, they are continuing to develop. Okay? So, of course, if students are producing more drafts, that does create more work for us, which isn't always a good thing. But I find that by the time the students reach this level, okay, it is possible to encourage them to assess their own work and that of their classmates if we give them some guidance and maybe like a simplified criteria. When I do it with my students, I'll often give them a checklist of features. So this could be features that they need to include in a spoken presentation or in an essay, for example. They can then use this checklist to check their own work. Okay. I'll often include the students in the process even more by developing the checklist with them. So we might have a discussion in the classroom of what features they think should be in maybe a spoken presentation, or what features should be in like a report, for example. Okay. So of course, this is never going to completely replace the assessment that we do or the valuable feedback that we give our students. However, it can just alleviate a bit of the pressure from us, and it also gives the students a greater sense of responsibility over their own learning. And that is a very important aspect of developing learner autonomy, giving the students a greater sense of responsibility for their own learning. Another way we can encourage our students to work more independently is by encouraging them to seek out their own authentic materials. So by this stage, advanced level students are in the great position of being able to understand and enjoy the same content in English as they do in their own language, to an extent. Okay, maybe not completely, but certainly to an extent. This opens up a lot of possibilities for the personalization of our lesson content. We can encourage our higher level students to produce their own kind of database of interesting articles or videos or webinars. Okay? If we get our students to produce this kind of database over a course, then we as teachers can use some of it in our own lessons. So it makes our life easier because we know that these are texts that our students are actually interested in. Often I'll set this kind of thing as like additional homework. So to read something from the database, and we can have a quick discussion or a discussion next lesson. Okay, so just to encourage the students to do more of this work independently. So as we know, texts that the students are genuinely interested in are a really good source of new vocabulary. But this is only true if our students know how to kind of identify and isolate and then extract, okay, the useful kind of chunks of language from this. By useful chunks, I mean maybe like collocations or certain idiomatic phrases. So we can call this process of identifying and extracting useful chunks from a text lexical mining. Okay, so as I said, this is the process of identifying and extracting useful chunks of language from a text. So when I do it with my students, I usually give them a very, very, very simple criteria to help them determine which chunks would be useful to extract. Okay, which chunks would be useful for them to take the time to look up the meaning of. So this is basically just a common sense kind of criteria, but I find it really focuses my students' attention on the task. So the criteria I give my students is, well, if they find a chunk and the meaning isn't immediately obvious, then they can consider extracting it. If this phrase is something they've never seen before, then they can consider extracting it. If the phrasing or the wording is different to how they would say something, then they should consider extracting it. And finally, if this phrase or chunk appears to be something connected to their area of study, or maybe something they're interested in, then they should definitely consider extracting it. Of course, like I said, this is just very common sense criteria to focus our students on this task. It's a really useful skill for them to have in order to develop their kind of ability to work independently, but they need some practice in the classroom to really kind of get good at this. Of course, once the students have kind of isolated the phrases, okay, and again, so this criteria, it's basically because our students, when we give them an authentic text, they can be a bit overwhelmed by all of this new language. So they're overwhelmed, maybe they're not going to learn like 30 new phrases. This is just to help them determine which might be useful for them to spend the time kind of doing this with. So once they've extracted it, they can then look up the meaning of this phrase, or they can bring this into the classroom where we can discuss it, together. I'll often do it with my students. I'll get them to kind of try and extract some phrases. They could do it in the classroom or with a text they've found. Bring the phrases in. We look up the meaning or infer the meaning. I then put the students in pairs and I get them to teach each other the phrases that they've discovered. I don't know about you, but my students love it when I give them the opportunity to be the teacher for a while, especially if they're kind of teaching their partner phrases which they have discovered and are kind of genuinely kind of interesting to them. So again, it's just a simple criteria to focus our students on the task. So that brings us to the end of today's webinar. Okay, as I said, this was just an overview, an overview to show how we can kind of change some elements of our approach to teaching higher level students to really kind of maintain their motivation. In the next webinars in this series with me, we'll be focusing more on the actual activities we can use to develop our students' kind of grammatical and lexical competence. So on Monday at 4 o'clock, there will be the next webinar with me. That'll be focusing really on the activities. That will also be repeated next Friday, again at 11 o'clock. So I did see your questions. Here we have a summary, okay, of some of the things that we've talked about today. I have been seeing a lot of good questions during the webinar, okay? So why is rubber stamping bad? Okay, so of course, sometimes if we're short of time at the end of a lesson, maybe, it's okay to immediately confirm that a student's answer is correct. And, with some students, they need to hear immediately that their answer is correct. But for other students that we know, maybe that have more potential, we don't want to immediately confirm their answer is correct if there is the possibility to push them a bit more, okay? So we don't say, correct. We'd say, okay, but, what about this? So it's just about pushing them a bit more so they can really, fulfill their full linguistic potential there. So of course, it's not always bad, but with certain higher level students, it's not always a good idea. Okay. So a student doesn't want to learn a particular grammar topic because he says that he isn't going to use these structures. Okay, that's an interesting question there. Well, I mean, in this kind of situation, this is perfect. It's perfect to use some authentic material. Okay, student says, I'm not going to need conditionals. Then show them a video of somebody using a conditional, like in a negotiation, for example. Okay, we need conditionals in negotiations. And many of our students, in many of the jobs they'll go into, will have to use negotiation in some way. So show them a realistic, authentic situation where that is required. And then, you don't have to say, I told you so, but you can do. This is a very good question, and I've experienced this with my own students. They may be very reluctant to assess each other's work, not to hurt one's feelings. Okay, this is a good question. So with my own class, I had this similar issue. I found that maybe at the beginning of the year, they're very reluctant to do this. Okay, I usually introduce this a bit later, once the students, have got time to get to know each other a bit and you've built some rapport. It's up to us to kind of create like a supportive atmosphere in the classroom where the students feel kind of okay giving each other some feedback. Okay, we need to stress that this is for everyone's like good, really. We're not being mean, we're trying to help each other. Okay, so yeah, that's a really good question. So how much time? Well, it really depends. For the lexical mining, we can do it often as an extended activity, as an extension to other kind of reading tasks. So once maybe we've looked at a text, maybe in the course book, maybe we've looked at answering some, comprehension questions, then afterwards we can get them to go back to the text and look for some new kind of phrases. Okay. In terms of time, it really depends on your group. I mean, you know your group better than me. I would always make sure they have enough time in class to do this so that, they've got this skill. They can do it at home. They can spend as much time as they want at home doing it. So there isn't a definite kind of set amount of time. Really, it depends on the class. Like I said, it's a good extension to other kind of reading lessons. I saw the question about Dictagloss, from Olga. Good question. So usually, actually, when I do it with my class, I will say that I will dictate the text twice. First time, sometimes I say to the students, pens down, no writing, just listen. Okay. Then the second time is when they can take notes. So really, again, it depends on the class. If they are slightly, the weaker end of, or lower kind of C1, or, they're slightly weaker students, then maybe let them take notes through both dictations. But usually I would dictate it twice if there's time, but usually twice. Okay, good. Yeah. Yeah, this is an interesting question. So it's quite common for students to say this. Well, yeah, my friend understands me, or I have a friend in London and we can talk, fine, he understands me, so what's the problem? We're like, okay, that's fine, but what is your goal for learning English? Do you want to sound like, quite good? Or is this something that you're wanting to, kind of not master, but to progress further with? Okay, we need to, again, highlight the fact as well that maybe your friend understands you, but there's a difference between somebody understanding you and kind of really not necessarily being impressed by your language, but being more on a par with this kind of native speaker that you speak to. Yes, I can show you the slides with the summary again. So here is the summary. Also, there will be a recording of this webinar on the website, so you can watch it again, if you missed anything today. So we have the second part,